Hey everybody, CVH here, and it's time for another tier list for Elder Scrolls Legends' newest expansion, Heroes of Skyrim. If you haven't checked out the legendary tier list slash crafting guide I did in the recent video, I strongly recommend you do so. This is the next step. Basically, we are now looking at the epics of Heroes of Skyrim. So if you didn't watch that video, what we did and what we're doing today is organizing the cards of this rarity through 5 tiers, A through E, A being the most played currently, the most competitively viable moving forward. Some of these are going to be cards to watch, and basically the highest power level in my personal opinion, and E will be the opposite end of that spectrum, cards you very rarely see. So this will help if you're looking to soul summon cards, if you're buying packs and you don't know which you should be excited about pulling, which you should definitely keep and try out. Hopefully this helps you out to some extent. And if you don't know the cards too well, maybe it's a little bit too small on screen, or if you just don't know Heroes of Skyrim too well yet, don't worry at all. We're going to go through the tiers right now, E through A in that order, and briefly discuss why I put each of these cards in the tier they're in currently. First up in the E tier is Barter. Now Barter is definitely a funny card, trading one card in your hand for a random card in your opponent's hand, but obviously this isn't really competitively viable. I've seen this card in a couple meme strategies before. Obviously you don't really want to be giving your cards away if your deck works as a functioning whole, and Barter itself doesn't really do anything for you. You're losing value and you're not even really sure you'll be picking up since you are getting a random card from your opponent's hand, so as of yet I don't think this card sees any actual competitive viability. Next up is Prized Chicken, and I shouldn't even really need to say it, but Prized Chicken isn't that good of a card. Imagine that, a 5-cost 0/1 with a very lackluster last gasp effect. The only time I've seen Prized Chicken actually seeing play is in combination with Barter, the last card we talked about actually, because you can just barter away Prized Chicken, which is almost definitely the worst card in your deck, and get anything from your opponent's hand, which is definitely better, because the 2 cards you just played were pretty terrible. So no, I don't recommend playing this card unless it's for strictly comedic effect. Thalmor Embassy is a really cool card, but unfortunately not really good yet. Ongoing support, making your High Elves cost 1 less. Now, right now I just don't think we have the pool of high elves for this card to be worth it, so I haven't seen a single Thalmor Embassy in constructed play. This is one of those cards that could change over time, however. Obviously, between this Barter and the Prized Chicken, if any of those are going to get better in the future, it's probably the Embassy. Unfortunately, the you can't be damaged by actions part of the effect simply isn't worth it to play this card, unless you're really getting a lot of benefit from the high elf synergy, which currently, like I mentioned, isn't really a thing, but moving forward, we could maybe see Thalmor Embassy seeing some play. Right now, though, I definitely wouldn't worry about it. The D tier is home to a bunch of cards that are a lot cooler and potentially more viable than the E tier, yet simply don't see play because there seem to be better options out there, and the first of those is Ancestor's Battle Axe. A fine effect. It's a very expensive item. You could play this in the item Battle Mage deck. I think I featured that on the channel in a video or 2 before. Outside of that, you simply don't want to include a 7-cost item that's only giving you +4/+4 with a buff to something that's not even on the board, and you don't even really know where the secondary buff is going. That said, this card could be seen in competitive play if it's gotten off of a card like Merrick Edrup's Wallet in the Merrick Battle Mage deck, but as a card that you would actually want to include in your deck, I don't think Battle Axe makes the cut the majority of the time. Similar to the Battle Axe is Duel Atop the World, which is relatively okay removal that I have seen in just a couple Control Warrior decks, but on the whole, Unstoppable Rage, which we got from the Fall of the Dark Brotherhood, does what this card is trying to do a lot better the vast majority of the time. So while this card isn't quite as bad as some of the others in this tier, it simply doesn't really need to be played in any deck that would want it. I'm pretty sure Unstoppable Rage is better. I have seen the rare deck that plays them both, but those decks haven't really made an impact, so I don't think I'd worry about creating this card if you don't already have them. Frost Troll is next, and what's holding this card back is obviously the attack power. Over time, this card could grow and get pretty annoying, but as I mentioned in the, I think the first impressions or the set review video for Endurance, that's the one. I don't think we got this card previewed ahead of time. This card could be potentially very annoying in Arena. That said, in Constructed, there are just better 4-drops on turn 4, and Frost Troll is going to take a lot of time to really get the momentum rolling, and by that time, there's a lot of efficient removal and silences in Constructed that can take care of this card too easily. So while it's a potentially annoying threat in Arena, I don't think it makes the cut in Constructed. Now, Dragon Cult Ghost is probably the most versatile card in the D tier today. You can technically play this card to fill out your curve at any point in the game, the problem with that being that no matter when you're playing the Cult Ghost, it's always just a little bit lackluster. A 1-cost 1/1 is not great, a 3-cost 3/3 is not great, a 5-cost 5/5 is not great. In Arena, all of those are kind of fine, and you will want those versatile cards that can act both as an early play and a late game option. I have seen this card see play exactly once at Legend in Constructed so far, post Heroes of Skyrim, and it wasn't great. I don't think this card is really going to stick in any competitive decks just because there are better threats in the late game, there are better cards in the early game, and you can make your deck tailored to have the appropriate number of each without relying on a card like the Cult Ghost. Moving forward, I think that's probably going to make it see less play than even it is right now, but I do think the card design is very cool, so I will give it props for that. Ah yes, Praetorian Commander, the card that used to be very much complained about when it gave everything +2/+2. As with a couple cards that we mentioned in the Legendary tier list, this card was nerfed very recently, so I'm glad I waited on making these crafting guides. Praetorian Commander has seen a substantial decrease in play since this card's nerf to +1/+1. I almost included it in the C tier still, but I think that's just me being wishful and thinking about when it actually saw play. After the nerf, I haven't seen this card one single time. Theoretically, you could still play it. It's not the worst card in the world, but you get punished so ridiculously hard for the tempo loss of the +1/+1, and you have to really duplicate the effect. You have to either play 2 of these or duplicate the effect with a Dark Rebirth or something just to attain the power level that the first Praetorian Commander would have given you before the nerf, and even that one wasn't usually backbreaking. That was still a pretty huge tempo loss, and you had to duplicate that one to really get the ball rolling. So right now, Praetorian Commander has been completely phased out basically by the nerf. Stormcloak Avenger, 4-cost 4/4 is not bad. At the end of your turn, if 3 or more friendly creatures died, summon a 2/2 Rallying Stormcloak. Now, that's an okay stat line for the card, but unfortunately stats alone aren't getting you anywhere unless you're playing Arena. So in Arena, I think this card is okay because you don't even really care about the effect not proccing too much. 3 or more friendly creatures dying in a single turn is actually pretty hard to accomplish. I haven't seen a constructed deck that can do that with much consistency or want to do that with much consistency. I don't think most decks' game plans involve sacrificing your own guys very aggressively, least of all not to just get a free 2/2, so while the card isn't horrible just as a 4-cost 4/4, that is by no means worth it in Constructed currently. Waves of the Fallen also has some versatility attached to it. You can either transform all enemies into 2/2 Stricken Draugrs, or transform all friendly creatures in a lane into 5/5 Hulking Draugrs. While it's versatile, it's also incredibly expensive. I could see including this card as sort of a, I don't want to say a budget replacement because it isn't epic, but if you're missing something like a Dawn's Wrath for a control spell sword, this could function as AoE removal that can take care of an entire lane, but it doesn't really take care of the entire lane, especially if the problem is that your opponent is beating you down with little guys. It's not killing things, it's just removing 1 or 2 large threats. Basically, in almost every single matchup, either a card like Mummifier and Piercing Javelin or a card like Dawn's Wrath or Ice Storm is going to be better. Very rarely would you really want to buff up your own little guys into 5/5 Hulking Draugrs. I would probably even play a card like Warcry over that effect, so this card gets points for versatility, but the power level is simply not very high. Moving on to the C tier, we're going to have a few cards that have seen some amount of play in maybe not quite high tier decks, but very interesting decks and very interesting cards, and the first of which is Hit and Run. Draw 5 cards, discard your hand at the end of the turn. I've seen this in exactly one deck, the Swindler's Market Archer deck, and in that deck it's pretty sweet because you're setting up those Swindler's Markets and Northwind Outposts, preferably multiple, then you can hit and run into a bunch of Nord Firebrands and maybe Raiding Party, and as long as you fire them off on the same turn, you could just kill your opponent with all that extra gas Hit and Run gives you for the turn. In every other deck, I don't think this card is too consistent. Even the aggro decks are unlikely to be in a point in the game where you can actually play a bunch of the stuff you're drawing from Hit and Run, and it is a horrible draw early on because obviously you can't really use it in those decks until a certain point in the game where you can actually make use of those cards in the same turn. So in Swindler's Archer, I would definitely give it a shot, but if you're not playing that specific deck, I don't think I would touch the card. Dragon Priest Mask is very cool for those item decks, and everyone knows I'm a fan of the item decks. I haven't played it in every single one, but in certain decks like the item Battle Mage, it can be cool to get these in the discard pile with cards like Palace Conspirator, and the Master of Arms gets them back, and then the summon effect of the Master of Arms goes off again, so you get more items attached to it, and you keep filtering through the entire discard pile. You can also use this in the Shackle item deck to duplicate the summon effect of a card like Giant Snake. So a cool card with some versatility. It is relatively expensive though, so you don't see it seeing play in a whole lot of these item decks, but specifically the ones that can get it into the discard pile in a sort of a cheaty way with the Palace Conspirators, or in the ones where you have multiple summon effects to take advantage of, not just the Master of Arms, like the Giant Snake I just mentioned. But outside of item decks, I don't think this card is ever going to be something you want to include. Forsworn Looter is very similar in that it's completely useless outside of those item decks, but in those item decks, it's pretty cool. You can search for those loots immediately, and if you buff this card with other items, which you're probably going to be playing a lot of given that you're playing an item deck, you can then basically choose what the looter is searching for. For example, if you play a Crown Quartermaster and a Steel Dagger on the looter, it'll have 2 attack and it can search for Enchanted Plate, or you could buff it up again, search for a Mace of Encumbrance or a Tome of Alteration. It is a pretty versatile card, obviously held back mostly by its limited use only in one style of deck, and its pretty horrible stats. This card is unlikely to stick on the board a whole lot of the time, but your opponent is going to have to respect it because it could, in essence, it can basically search for any of your items if you have the appropriate way to buff it. And even bare minimum, it can search for something with a cost of 1, so that could eventually get out of hand if your opponent doesn't respect it. Shadow Green Elder is sort of a personal favorite of mine from a design standpoint. I think the Animal Spriggan strategies are pretty cool. That said, right now I don't think they're very good. So besides possibly Wolf Cage, this card has seen less play than any other card on the C tier that I currently have, and I'm including it mostly because my perception of its power level is that it's pretty high. It's just not currently used in any top tier decks, if that makes any sense. If that deck starts to get more traction in upcoming sets, we get some more good animals and more reasons to play an animal-based deck or a Spriggan-based deck, Shadow Green Elder seems like a pretty obvious inclusion for those, because I think the card is really high impact on 7 and can turn your board into a nightmare for your opponent very quickly. Right now, that's not really a thing, so I probably would put this in the D tier based on playability, but it does seem significantly more powerful than many of the cards in the D tier currently. It's just waiting for the right opportunity to be playable. And last but not least in the C tier is Wolf Cage, which, like College of Winterhold in the Legendary Crafting Guide, has only really seen play in that one mage support control deck. In that deck, utilizing Wolf Cage to fill your board up really quickly with tokens, in combination with Cauldron Keeper, which we'll be talking about in Tower Alchemist, can be incredibly powerful, but it does require some specific support cards to make use of it, and outside of that strategy, those support cards aren't really seeing play. So if you're playing the support control mage deck or you think that looks like a cool strategy, Wolf Cage is totally reasonable to play as a 2 or maybe even 3 of, but outside that deck, it's just not good enough. And moving on to the B tier, we have another card that's really good in those support control mage decks, and really not something you want to play outside of them, Cauldron Keeper. And I'm putting this in the B tier because its power level is actually pretty high compared to Wolf Cage. That said, it probably will only see play in decks that really want to take advantage of those supports, but the effect is incredibly relevant for those decks. You get a whole extra use on any supports you currently have up when you play the Cauldron Keeper, and as long as it stays alive, you can activate your supports an extra time each turn, which can immediately turn those into hugely threatening cards, and your opponent's going to have to deal with the Cauldron Keeper relatively quickly. And by itself, it's not super fragile. Even when you don't have supports up, you can use this in the support control mage deck to just stave off aggression because a 3-5 guard really isn't bad. Thornhist Mage has the same exact stat line, and it's pretty good just to stave off that early pressure, and obviously if you're getting those support benefits immediately, the card goes from good to very, very fantastic very quickly. So if you're going to play that deck, Cauldron Keeper is an absolute necessity. It's one of the reasons people have experimented with it in the first place, and obviously if you're just trying to play a regular control deck, Cauldron Keeper really doesn't have much synergy with what you're trying to do. Corrupted Shade, unlike Frost Troll, which we've talked about, has actually successfully somewhat competed for a lot of the 4-drop endurance slots in decks like the mid-range Sorcerer. Not in every single build, but this card is really, really powerful as a 4-drop, really good stats, and it has ward, so it's going to be tricky for your opponent to get rid of immediately. If you're pushing face with this card, you don't even have to worry about losing the ward. That said, you can use this card to take pretty favorable trades and then silence off the effect with a card like Shadowfen Priest or Curse Spectre, and that'll mean the Shade lives for longer. It's kind of a sketchy use of a silence, but if you want the 5-5 to stick around, that is an option. Obviously, if you're just pushing face, your opponent will likely only be able to pop the ward on their turn, not just straight up kill the card, and while that will mean your Shade will die on the end of your turn, if you don't silence the effect off of it, you still get to push that bit of extra damage. So it can be a pretty threatening card for your opponent to have to deal with. They have to waste resources into it, and again, they run the risk of you just silencing the effect off of it, so a pretty good inclusion in mid-range Sorcerer decks, depending on how much silence you're playing and what your game plan is. I wouldn't play it in all of them, but I have tested it somewhat, and it's been pretty powerful. Deepwood Trapper hasn't really seen as much play as some of the others on the B tier, but I do think the power level is extremely high on this card. I just don't think we've really seen which decks it's supposed to go in yet. The meta is still being refined, to some degree, and of course, in the future more cards could be released to make decks that would use Deepwood Trapper better, but a 1-drop 1/3 with guard is already not bad, and it's shackling the creatures damaged by the Deepwood Trapper. Obviously, if your opponent's attacking into the guard, it's going to eat some amount of damage and then shackle that creature for an additional turn, so it makes it a fantastic defensive option in the early game. We haven't seen much of this card, even though it's not super bad against aggro decks, I think just because there aren't that many hyper-aggressive decks. But if you're looking for an answer to really aggressive cards on turns 1 and 2, Deepwood Trapper has good stats, good effect obviously with the shackling, and it's a guard, so your opponent's going to have to deal with it in some way. I'm looking forward to seeing in the future where Deepwood Trapper could fit in that it currently is not. Shadowmaster is another card that, again, hasn't seen as much play as I would have expected, but the card by itself is pretty fine, and I do think in the future there will be definitely some decks that want to abuse the Shadowmaster. Obviously, you could even use it currently on something like a Goblin Skulk to give it cover and make it untargetable by actions until your next turn. That's a really powerful curve. Ring into Goblin Skulk, ring into Shadowmaster, make sure you can get that additional pilfering. Could be good in pilfer decks as well. This card is just really annoying. Making your cards more uninteractive is definitely a good thing to be doing in a game where everything is decided by attacks and basically actions and creature effects. You have to be targeting your opponent's stuff on your turn, and Shadowmaster kind of negates that. By itself, it's not the most amazing card. Obviously, 3-drop 3/3, you need to have something on board that you can benefit from giving cover. You could just give it to the Shadowmaster itself, but it really benefits when you have a creature with pilfer that you need to get through, or something that you just really don't want them to kill, like a Mournhold Trader, prevent them from lightning bolting it. Right now, we're not seeing this card in a huge variety of decks, but I do think people are going to eventually catch on to the card's power level, and of course, in the future, we could always get more cards that really encourage you to use Shadowmaster's effect on them early. Arcane Enchanter is the last card on the B tier today, and it's another one of those good item cards. When you draw an item, give it a random keyword. On the surface, this card looks kind of slow, but it has seen a lot of play in all the item decks that aren't using agility, because in agility, you can use Snaketooth Necklace, and a lot of your plan, in particular in the item Sorcerer deck against aggro decks, is to jam an early Arcane Enchanter and eventually roll Drain on something with its effect. If you can do that, you can get back into the game. The other keywords are a nice bonus, like Ward, Charge, and Guard could all be incredibly relevant, even lethal sometimes, but basically the Drain is what you're looking for in this card, and it gives the deck a lot of game against aggro, whereas otherwise it'd be a particularly weak matchup because you're wasting so much time trying to find your combo pieces, and then your aggro opponents basically got you dead on board. So the Arcane Enchanter rolling Drain has given the deck a bit more viability in that matchup, so this card's power level is basically hand in hand with however good item decks are in the current meta. The first card in our A tier that has made a pretty large competitive impact is Bandit Ringleader. I first looked at this card and thought it was very cool for Pilfer Monk. Unfortunately, while it has been proven to be good in those styles of decks, Pilfer Monk still hasn't been that much a part of the metagame itself. Where this card has seen a bigger impact is in Token Crusader lists, because you can use the Ringleader with cards like Nord Firebrands that you're getting from Raiding Party and Markarth Bannerman, and immediately draw a bunch of cards, sort of like an unconditional Triumphant Jarl with 3/5 stat line, and that's really, really good, especially when you're pairing it with cards like Relentless Raider, because every time you break those runes in those big pushes, your effect's going to proc, deal 1 extra damage, and that does count as Pilfer, so you get to draw another card each time a Relentless Raider procs. That's really one of the main combos of the Token Crusader deck, and how it generates a lot of value and card advantage for more gas, for more pushes, while beating you down for a lot of damage in a single turn. And I think Bandit Ringleader could also see play in other decks moving forward. Like I mentioned, people have tested it in Pilfer Monk to some success for the card, not so much a lot of success for the deck itself, but I do think if that deck comes to prominence in the future, Bandit Ringleader could be a major player in it, and I'm excited to see where this card goes in the future, but basically, I would say that it's one of the more powerful epics from the expansion just from its play in Token Crusader alone. And the final card we'll be talking about today in the A tier is Thief of Dreams, which is getting an A tier spot because it has seen more play, I would say, at High Legend than any of the other cards on this list, with the possible exception of pre-nerf Praetorian Commander, but that card's nerfed now, so Thief of Dreams is definitely the most played in my opinion. 5-drop 5/5 is already kind of reasonable. We mentioned that it wasn't good enough by itself with Dragon Cult Ghost, but unlike the Cult Ghost, this card has an amazing upside of an effect. A lot of the time you're going to be getting an additional card from your opponent's opponent's hand. You're not stealing it, but you are copying it, and that'll not only give you the knowledge of what they have, but also that card advantage. And if you've been paying attention to how they've been playing and what they may or may not have been playing up to that point in the game, if you have good knowledge of the style of deck they're playing and what they're trying to accomplish, you can make reads on what your opponent's having and just get that card advantage more often than not. And even if you do whiff on the effect, even if you weren't able to make a good read, at the bare minimum you will know that the other card that you didn't pick is in your opponent's hand, and that can be pretty crucial knowledge. So I've seen this card in aggro decks, mid-range decks, even some slower decks. The card is just very, very powerful. I've seen it in many mid-range sorcerer decks, mid-range assassin, aggro battle mage. It's almost a staple in those decks at this point. So Thief of Dreams has definitely performed very highly. I think people looked at it the first time the card was revealed in the expansion, and they thought it was going to be very powerful, and it has lived up to the hype, unlike several other cards that we've talked about. So if you're looking to play decks with intelligence, I would say pick up Thief of Dreams. And it's kind of funny that intelligence was already very good in the meta, and they gave us Encano, that we talked about in the legendary tier list, which is kind of an instant inclusion, and Thief of Dreams, which might not be as quite ubiquitous as Encano is, but probably the best epic on this list. So those are my thoughts, and those are my tiers for the Heroes of Skyrim epics. As always, if you agree or disagree, I'd love to hear it. Join the conversation in the comments and let me know what you think about any of these cards. And I would like to do more of these tier lists in the future if you guys enjoyed them. So feel free to let me know if you enjoyed this format for the epics and legendaries that we've done in the past couple videos. Hopefully you found this video helpful, especially if you're a newer player getting into the game and trying to figure out which epics you should pick up. As always, if you did, feel free to leave a like and subscribe to the channel for more Legends content. Feel free to check out my stream in the description, and I'll see you guys next time.